Now that we've gone through the basics of fabric and weave, we can now focus on the basics of patterns and their construction lines. And of course, how these two relate together. So we had fabric way before we had pattern cutting systems. And fabric being the way it is, has had a lot of influence on how our cutting systems and principles developed. Obviously, our predecessors worked themselves to the ground trying to find the most reliable, simple, and efficient way to create patterns, but they often came up with some complex frog shit that only made sense to the individual who made it up. And it really didn't get any better until the Industrial Revolution kicked in, mass production developed, uniforms for schools, factories, and other jobs were in high demand, and that is when we really started to move towards our more modern pattern cutting systems. So what does all of this have to do with striking out some patterns on fabric, for crying out loud? Well, it all has to do with the construction lines of the pattern, which are basically representations of the vertical and the horizontal axis of the weave. And one of the most important construction lines that we have when it comes to the upper body is the center front, the center back, and the chest line. Now, let's just have a look at this drawing for a second. Now, imagine that you are this mannequin, and what we are going to do is we're going to simplify your body shape to the lowest resolution possible. If we would do that, you would turn into this cylinder. Let's also ignore the legs here and just imagine that we are a cylinder sitting on the ground, and this green line represents the ground. Now, suppose that we would wrap a tape around your chest, your cylinder chest, to measure the circumference of your chest. And that we would also draw a line that goes from the very top to the bottom, right down the middle, on the front and the back of your body. What we now have is 3 construction lines. You have the center front, the center back, and the chest line. Now, what do these represent, really? Very simple. The vertical line, which is your center front and your center back, represents the warp of the fabric, which was, if you remember, the vertical axis of the weave. Now, the chest line, on the other hand, represents the horizontal line, the weft of the fabric, which was, again, if you remember, the horizontal axis of the fabric. So we have the warp and we have the weft on a cylinder. If we look at the side of the mannequin, we can see that there is an armhole here. If we draw a line in front of the armhole and a line at the back of the armhole, what we're doing in essence is we're adding 2 new construction lines to the cylinder. And these 2 new lines have the potential to become our new seams. So if we would cut the panels up or the cylinder up these areas, we would now have seams in this 2 lines, on these 2 lines. Now, when we draw these 2 lines, what we're doing in essence is we're also splitting up the cylinder into 6 different parts, panels we call them. We have 2 front panels, 2 back panels, and 2 side panels. Imagine that we only take 1/2 of the cylinder, and as we have these lines drawn on the cylinder, we would just extract that on a piece of flat paper. What we would get is something like this. So we have the center front here, center back, the chest line, armhole, and the 2 lines in front and the back of the armhole. Now, we could say that this is a very primitive version, a low resolution version of a jacket coat pattern. Obviously, we need shoulder lines and we need to get rid of the excess on top of the armhole. We need neck circles. So let's just do that. If we do that, this is what our pattern now is going to look like. So suppose that we add all the details necessary and create our final pattern. What our final pattern is going to look like is this. You can see clearly reflections. Well, you can see that if we would simplify this, it would fit into here. If we would simplify this, it would fit into here, and so on. Okay? Now, what do these shapes that we have here in front of us on our chalk line have in common? Well, It's very simple. They all have a chest line running through them, which is that same tape we wrapped around the cylinder. And they also all have a center front and a center back. And of course, on this one, the center back is shaped and the center frog is shaped. The center front is shaped. So, but if we just simplify this again and we just go a couple of steps back, you could see that the most simple form is just a rectangle with a chest line. And we can wrap this rectangle just around half a cylinder, and we can see that the center front and the center back match while the chest line does as well. We can look at it in a different way. We could say that the basic fundamental idea of the modern pattern cutting system is this picture. And what this drawing says is that when you wrap the garment, which is basically the combination of all panels together around the body, you should have the chest line parallel to the floor from front, side, and back view at all times while still addressing the individual figure. That's the basic idea. So when you look at this body with the garment on top, if this was a check fabric, our checks would start from the front panel, run alongside the chest line, parallel to the floor, into the sleeve, into the back, just as we have them here. Here we have a chest line. Let's say this was our horizontal check. It would just move from the front panel into the side body, into the back. And if we had sleeves, then the same thing would be true. If the sleeve is cut correctly, of course, and is matched on the correct position, that chest line is just going to run through the sleeve, both top sleeve and on the sleeve, and that will make the checks match in the most basic explanation. Obviously, we're going to do this a lot more in-depth and talk about patterns in a different video, but now you kind of should have an idea of what these construction lines that we just mentioned, the center back, center front, and the chest represent. And they represent basically the warp and the weft of the fabric. So now that we know this, let's move on to the next part, which is the striking out and everything we need to know about that.